Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. I think it's really fascinating. I come from a state where we obviously have forest fires, but generally not the extent as you have out west. So I do find this fascinating, and I actually appreciate whether you are on board with climate change or not. I don't think I even heard that word used, because we're talking about the practical things we can do, and I want to focus on that. Again, not coming from a western state, Ms. Andriani, you talked about the post-fire and the flooding afterwards. Is it because these things are sparked by huge thunderstorms and that cause, or is there something else occurring? Is there lack of vegetation that's not absorbing the moisture? I mean, just describe what's happening, geologically, that you have post-fire floods. I'm fascinated by that.
Thank you, Senator. We, in the Southwest, and actually Utah, other areas of the West, experience what's called, a monsoon, a traditional monsoon in the summer, typically anywhere from end of June through September. And then certainly you've seen in California, the atmospheric rivers, you've seen other types of rainfall events, mountain thunderstorms that can create post-wildfire flooding. So that's the dynamic. What you see on the ground is that when a wildfire occurs, particularly if it's a severe wildfire with very severe impacts to the soil actually becomes hydrophobic.
So it can't absorb it.
It acts like glass. And that will typically take place through an initial season, maybe even longer depending upon the circumstances. And so you get this massive increase in flood flows. We have seen in an area recently that was burned up to 26 times the pre-fire flood flows in those areas. So you're getting massive removal of sediment. In many of these areas, we have steep slopes that have burned very severely. So you're getting massive wasting of sediment, debris that's coming from the wooded area. You no longer have any foliage to deflect the rainfall, and so you see these catastrophic events after the fire.
It's coincidental. I mean, the massive flooding is caused by the fact they had a fire beforehand, but and oftentimes it occurs more than 72 hours, then that's a problem for federal funding.
Exactly. There's this window between events, and so, for example, after the pipeline fire in 2022, we had 45 major flood events that summer. But if you have once you have a flood event, then they create a 72-hour window within which you aren't eligible. And so we never reach, even though the total amount is over double our current threshold, financial threshold for a declaration, we never met the declaration level. So that means we're not eligible for reimbursement, and it means we're not eligible for public assistance.
So again, I think we're all aware that the federal government creates these rules. Sometimes they're at cross purposes, and sometimes they don't make sense. So again, I appreciate the testimony so that we can hopefully get that in better alignment. At the same time, permitting and the cross purposes of the agencies. I know Ms. Curry mentioned the fact that the EPA is all about reducing smoke, but one of the mitigating factors would be to do controlled burns. So, Mr. Ferguson, you mentioned your groups, your agencies got together and you came up with, I think you said, 148 different recommendations that were 100% agreed to. Laying aside the financing and some of those permitting, can you talk about the mitigation? Because I've always heard we're just not removing the fuel. Talk about controlled burns. I mean, what are the best things we can do in terms of mitigation that everybody agrees to?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much. This is a very wicked problem. There's not an easy answer that we just need to do more prescribed burns on the forest lands, because we're talking forest lands, we're talking rangelands, we're talking the built environment. And so it's using the biomass tools that we talked about earlier, so that way we can take out the dead and down timber that is not salvageable for costing, using the logging operations, doing controlled burn operations. And we do run into some issues with controlled burn operations, because when we look at using FEMA hazard mitigation funds, we're not allowed to do controlled burns, but we can do controlled burns using federal, using Forest Service or BLM funds.
But you also have problems with anti-loggers, that type of thing as well, right?
100%. And that's why it's kind of the wicked problem of how do we reduce the fuel volume in the forest environment, the rangeland environment, and the built environment. And some of that also involves using wildland urban interface codes. That way we have homeowners that are actually protecting their communities around it, tying our community wildland fire protection plans that are required for or dealing with the Forest Service and BLM with the FEMA's hazard mitigation plans. That way there's one cohesive plan on how we're going to reduce that risk.
You know, I continue to see, different charts saying that, we really don't have an increase in the number of acres being burned every year. Over time, it's actually decreased. But I think oftentimes, like hurricanes as well, we've just built up so much valuable real estate on the coast, or, we built, so many expensive homes in fire-prone areas. I mean, is that the issue here? And, I thought it was interesting, too. You can't have any federal funding until it actually crosses into state land, which, again, seems insane, but kind of understand that. Ms. Morrell, you were...
Certainly, I'd like to address the building toward risk. You're absolutely right there, sir. We are building toward risk. We continue to build toward fire-prone lands. And if we do so without proper ingress and egress for the population living there, without proper building codes being implemented, adopted, and enforced using fire-resistant materials, we know that geography is going to burn. And so we have to pre-plan for that so that we don't have these disasters. Fire is going to be normal. We are going to have fire-adapted communities, but they must pre-plan. And the federal government cannot bring all the solutions to this. It's too big a problem. So individuals who choose to live there are going to have to mitigate their property. We are taking a heavy role in that, in education about what mitigation looks like. What does right look like? Keeping vegetation off your home, not using mulch, not having wood fences. These are very practical solutions to making a fire-prone community.
Well, just real quick, as you read more about the Maui and Lahaina disaster, people just knew that was a disaster waiting to hit, and just did. Is there kind of a booklet? Is there a publication of here are the real concerning areas? People weren't thinking about this before. They moved in there because people like to live around trees. Okay, have we identified these areas and we're just simply not addressing them, or what are we doing toward that? And apologize going over time here.
We are continuing to identify those risks. We can look at a fire risk index for the wild land for our forested areas. What we do not yet have is a fire risk index for the built environment. So as we build toward those risks, because of the building materials that are being used, because of climate change, which you appropriately brought up, the drought that we're having, all of the soil moisture reduction. So on one side of the island in Maui, it's perfectly green. On the other side, everything is dry. And so we're seeing that not only across the islands, but in areas across the nation that have never burned before, Louisiana, for example. And so these are areas that we have to pay attention. If we're going to build here, coupled with climate change, we've got to bring solution pre, not post necessarily.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. My bipartisan bill, the Fire Grants and Safety Act, reauthorizes the U.S. Fire Administration, the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program,